the quiet village of Greenwood, where traditions were as deeply rooted as the old oak trees that lined its roads, lived a small girl with big dreams. Lynn was just 8 years old, with curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around her, and a smile that could brighten even the gloomiest day. She lived with her grandmother in a tiny house at the edge of the village, where the forest began and the world seemed full of whispers and secrets. Their home was simple but warm, filled with the smell of her grandmother's cooking and the soft humming that always accompanied her work. Lynn's parents had moved to the city years ago, looking for better jobs to support the family. They sent money when they could, but visits were rare and precious. Life in Greenwood moved at its own pace. Children went to the small school during the day, and in the evenings they helped their parents with chores or played in the village square. For most people, this was enough. But Lynn always felt there was something more waiting for her, though she couldn't quite name what it was. That something began to take shape on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The children had been let out of school early because of a leaking roof, and Lynn found herself wandering through the village with nowhere particular to go. Her grandmother was visiting a sick friend and wouldn't be home for hours. As the rain grew heavier, Lynn ducked into the community center, a large building that had once been the home of a wealthy family who had left the village long ago. Now it served as a meeting place, a library of sorts, and occasionally a venue for special events when important people visited from the city. The center was quiet that day. The old caretaker, Mr. Wu, nodded at her from behind his desk but didn't shoo her away. He knew her grandmother well and had a soft spot for the quiet child who always said please and thank you. Lynn shook the raindrops from her hair and walked slowly through the main hall. She had been here many times before for village gatherings, but had never had the chance to really look around. The walls were lined with faded photographs of stern-faced people from the past and certificates of achievement earned by villagers over the years. But it was the room at the end of the hall that had always caught her attention. The door was usually closed, but today it stood slightly ajar. Lynn glanced back at Mr. Wu, who had dozed off in his chair, then tiptoed toward the mysterious room. Pushing the door open just enough to slip through, Lynn found herself in what must have been the grandest room in all of Greenwood. Sunlight filtered through tall windows despite the rain clouds, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. The ceiling was higher than in any room Lynn had ever seen, and the walls were painted a soft blue that reminded her of the sky on clear days. But it was the object in the center of the room that made her heart beat faster. There, on a slightly raised platform, stood a grand piano. Its polished black surface gleamed even in the dim light, and its presence filled the room with an unspoken importance. Lynn had seen pianos before, but only in books or on the small television at her friend's house. She knew what they were called and what they did, but she had never been close to one. In Greenwood, music was not considered a necessary part of life. People sang work songs in the fields or hummed lullabies to their children, but musical instruments were seen as luxuries that belonged to the world of cities and wealth. The piano had been donated to the community center years ago by a wealthy businessman who had grown up in Greenwood. It was kept more as a symbol of pride than as an instrument to be played. On rare occasions, when distinguished guests visited, someone from the city would be brought in to play it. The rest of the time, it sat silent and untouched, an elegant stranger in a simple village. Lynn approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Standing before it, she felt very small. Her fingers tingled with an urge she couldn't explain. What would it feel like to touch those keys? What sounds would they make under her fingertips? She glanced back at the door, half expecting to see Mr. Wu's disapproving face. But the doorway remained empty. Taking a deep breath, Lynn reached out and pressed a single white key. The note rang out clear and pure, filling the room with its voice. Lynn pulled her hand back quickly, surprised by the sound and afraid someone might have heard. But after a few seconds of silence, she reached out again, this time pressing a black key. The sound was different, deeper, and somehow more serious. Something awakened inside Lynn at that moment. It was as if the piano had spoken directly to her heart in a language she somehow already knew. Without thinking about it, she pressed another key and another, creating a simple pattern of sounds that wasn't exactly music but wasn't just noise either. Time seemed to stop as Lynn explored the keyboard, moving her small fingers from one end to the other, discovering how the notes changed from deep rumbles on the left to bird-like chirps on the right. She didn't know what she was doing, but it felt right. as if her hands had been waiting all her life to find these keys. She was so absorbed in her exploration that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching. It wasn't until a shadow fell across the piano that Lynn looked up, startled to see Mrs. Chen, the director of the community center, standing in the doorway. Her face was a mask of shock and disapproval. "What do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice sharp as a knife. Lynn's hands flew away from the keyboard as if it had suddenly become hot. This is not a toy." Mrs. Chen strode into the room, her heels clicking loudly on the wooden floor. "This piano is very expensive and very valuable. It's not for children to play with, especially not—" She paused, looking Lynn up and down, taking in her simple clothes and worn shoes. "Especially not children who don't know anything about music?" Lynn felt her cheeks burn with shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking down at her feet. "You should be. What would your grandmother think? Does she know you go around touching things that don't belong to you?" The mention of her grandmother made Lynn's stomach twist with guilt. She was a good woman who worked hard and had taught Lynn to be respectful and to stay out of trouble. "Mr. Wu let me in because of the rain," Lynn explained, her voice small. Mrs. Chen sighed impatiently. "That old man would let anyone in. But this room is supposed to be kept locked for a reason. This piano is for special occasions only, not for children to bang on." By now, other people had been drawn by the commotion. Mr. Wu appeared in the doorway, looking confused and a little afraid. Behind him stood two women who helped run the center and a man Lynn recognized as a member of the village council. "What's happening?" the man asked, peering into the room. "I caught this child playing with the piano," Mrs. Chen explained, gesturing toward Lynn as if she had been caught doing something far worse than touching a musical instrument. The councilman frowned. "That piano is community property. It represents our village's connection to the modern world. It's not a plaything." Lynn wanted to explain that she hadn't been playing with it, not really. She had been discovering it, learning from it. But the words wouldn't come. The adults were looking at her with such disappointment that her throat felt tight, and her eyes began to sting with unshed tears. "I know her grandmother," one of the women said. "She's a hard-working woman, very respected. She'd be so embarrassed to know her granddaughter was touching valuable things without permission." "Someone should tell her," the other woman agreed. "The child needs to learn respect for community property." Lynn felt as if she were shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller under their critical gazes. The piano, which had seemed so magical just moments ago, now felt like a forbidden object that had gotten her into terrible trouble. "I think you should go home now," Mrs. Chen said firmly, taking Lynn by the shoulder and steering her toward the door. "And I don't want to see you in this room again, understood? This piano is not for someone like you." As Lynn was led past the small group of adults, she heard them murmuring among themselves. "Children these days have no sense of their place," one said. "Think they can do whatever they want," another added. Outside, the rain had stopped, but Lynn barely noticed. She walked home slowly, her earlier joy completely forgotten. All she could think about was the feeling of the piano keys under her fingers and the beautiful sounds they had made. Despite the scolding, despite the shame, she couldn't regret touching the piano. Something had awakened inside her, a hunger she had never known before. At home, Lynn sat by the window waiting for her grandmother to return. She wondered if Mrs. Chen or one of the others would tell her what had happened. She wondered what her grandmother would say, but deeper than these worries was a new thought, a new dream taking shape. Somehow, someday, she would play that piano again, and next time she would make it sing so beautifully that no one would think of scolding her. Outside, a bird began to sing, its clear notes rising and falling in the quiet afternoon. Lynn closed her eyes and listened, her fingers moving slightly on her lap, already imagining those notes on the magical black and white keys she had discovered today. Lynn didn't tell her grandmother about the piano that evening. Every time she tried to form the words, her throat tightened and she remembered the disapproving looks on the adults' faces. Instead, she helped prepare dinner, setting out the bowls and chopsticks on their small table while her grandmother stirred a pot of fragrant vegetable soup. "You're quiet tonight," her grandmother said, glancing at Lynn with kind eyes that missed very little. "Did something happen at school today?" Lynn shook her head. "School ended early because of the rain," she said, which was true enough. Her grandmother nodded but didn't press further. She was a woman of few words herself, believing that people would share their troubles when they were ready. After dinner, Lynn helped wash the dishes, then sat by the window with a book from school, though the words on the page blurred as her mind kept returning to the piano. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Lynn walked to school along the muddy path, puddles from yesterday's rain reflecting the blue sky above. She was almost at the schoolyard when she heard someone call her name. Turning, she saw Mrs. Chen coming toward her, walking briskly despite her age. Lynn's heart sank. She had hoped that maybe the incident would be forgotten, that Mrs. Chen had more important things to worry about than a child touching a piano, but the serious look on the woman's face told her otherwise. "I spoke with your grandmother this morning," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. Lynn's eyes widened. "You did?" Mrs. Chen nodded. "I went by your house before you woke up." She needed to know what happened. Lynn looked down at her shoes, now muddy from the walk. She could imagine how disappointed her grandmother must have been to hear that Lynn had misbehaved, had touched something valuable without permission. "She asked me not to be too hard on you," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice softening slightly. "She said you've always been a curious child." Lynn looked up, surprised by this information. Her grandmother hadn't seemed upset at breakfast, had treated her just the same as always. "But curiosity must be properly directed," Mrs. Chen went on, her tone becoming stern again. "The piano isn't a toy, Lynn. It's a sophisticated instrument that requires years of training and education to play properly. Education that isn't available here in Greenwood." Lynn nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You need to understand your place in this world," Mrs. Chen said, placing a hand on Lynn's shoulder. "We all have our roles to play. Your grandmother is one of the best seamstresses in the village. Perhaps you'll follow in her footsteps someday. That would be a respectable path for a girl like you." "But the piano," she shook her head. "That's for people from the city, people with money and time for such things." The school bell rang in the distance, saving Lynn from having to respond. Mrs. Chen gave her shoulder a final pat. "Run along now. And remember what I said. No more touching the piano." Lynn hurried toward the school building, fighting back tears. It wasn't fair. Why should only rich people from the city be allowed to play the piano? Why did she need years of education just to touch the keys and make beautiful sounds? The notes she had played yesterday hadn't sounded wrong or bad to her. School that day was a blur. Lynn sat at her desk, copying characters into her notebook and answering questions when called upon. But her mind was elsewhere. During lunch break, she sat alone under a tree in the schoolyard, picking at her food without much appetite. "Why are you hiding over here?" a voice asked. Lynn looked up to see May, a girl from her class. They weren't exactly friends, but they sometimes played together during breaks. Lynn shrugged. "Just thinking," May plopped down beside her. "I heard you got in trouble for touching the piano at the community center." When Lynn looked at her in surprise, May grinned. "My mom helps clean the center. She heard Mrs. Chen talking about it." Lynn sighed. "So everyone would know soon. In a village as small as Greenwood, news traveled faster than wind." "Mrs. Chen said I shouldn't have touched it," Lynn admitted. "She said the piano is only for special people." May made a face. "That's silly. It's just a big box with keys. My cousin in the city has a small keyboard. He lets me play with it whenever we visit." "Really?" Lynn turned to her, suddenly interested. "What does it sound like?" May waved her hand dismissively. "It makes noise when you press the buttons. It's not that exciting. I'd rather play ball games." Lynn nodded, but inside she disagreed. The piano had seemed like the most exciting thing in the world to her. But maybe May was right. Maybe she should just forget about it and focus on more practical things, like helping her grandmother or getting good grades in school. By the time Lynn got home that afternoon, it seemed as if everyone in the village knew about her piano incident. As she walked through the village square, she noticed people glancing her way and whispering. One older woman actually clicked her tongue disapprovingly as Lynn passed. When she reached home, her grandmother was sitting on the porch, mending a shirt. She looked up as Lynn approached, her face unreadable. "Come sit with me," she said, patting the spot beside her. Lynn sat down, her heart beating fast. Here it comes, she thought. The lecture, the disappointment. Her grandmother set her sewing aside and turned to face Lynn. "Mrs. Chen came to see me this morning." "I know," Lynn said in a small voice. "She told me. She was quite upset about you touching the piano." Lynn nodded, studying her hands in her lap. She thinks you should learn to be more practical, to focus on skills that will be useful to you here in Greenwood. Her grandmother's voice was gentle but serious. She's not entirely wrong, you know. Life here follows certain patterns. People who try to break those patterns often end up disappointed. Lynn felt tears welling up in her eyes. Even her grandmother thought she should forget about the piano. But then her grandmother reached out and lifted Lynn's chin, making her look up. But I also know that some birds aren't meant to stay in the nest they were born in. Some need to fly farther to see more of the sky. Lynn blinked, confused by her grandmother's words. I saw something in your eyes this morning, her grandmother continued. A light that wasn't there before. And I think that light has something to do with the piano. Lynn nodded slowly. It made the most beautiful sounds, Grandma. When I touched the keys, it was like I could feel the music before I even heard it. Does that make sense? Her grandmother smiled. More than you know. She picked up Lynn's hand and looked at her fingers, running her thumb gently over them. You have your mother's hands. Long fingers, good for detailed work. She paused. Your mother used to love music too before she decided that practical concerns were more important. Lynn stared at her grandmother in surprise. Her mother had never mentioned any interest in music. People will talk, her grandmother said, releasing Lynn's hand. They already are. They'll say you're getting above yourself, that you're dreaming too big for a girl from Greenwood. It will be hard to hear those things. I know, Lynn whispered. And I can't promise you that anything will come of this interest of yours. The piano at the center is off limits now, and we certainly can't afford one of our own. Lynn nodded, understanding the reality of their situation. Her grandmother's sewing brought in just enough for them to live comfortably, but there was little left over for luxuries. But I don't want you to stop dreaming. Lynn, dreams are what keep us going through the hard days. She picked up her sewing again. Just be prepared for people to misunderstand. Lynn's grandmother was right. In the days that followed, it seemed as if the entire village had an opinion about the girl who thought she could play the piano. Some were merely amused, treating it as a child's passing fancy. Others were more critical, suggesting that Lynn was getting fancy ideas that wouldn't serve her well. Even Lynn's teacher pulled her aside after class one day. Mrs. Chen tells me you've developed an interest in the piano, she said, her tone making it clear that this wasn't necessarily a good thing. While curiosity is admirable, I hope you're not neglecting your studies for unrealistic pursuits. No, teacher, Lynn assured her, though in truth, her mind often wandered during lessons, imagining melodies and wondering what different combinations of keys would sound like. The worst came a week after the incident, when Lynn overheard two women talking at the village well as she was fetching water. It's a shame about Hoy's granddaughter, one said, not noticing Lynn approaching. Getting such big ideas at such a young age. It will only lead to disappointment. I blame those city parents of hers, the other replied, sending money but never coming home. The child probably thinks life is easy everywhere. Well, she needs to learn that people like us don't become musicians or artists. The sooner she accepts that, the happier she'll be. Lynn hurried away before they saw her, water sloshing from her bucket as tears blurred her vision. Was that true? Were there things she couldn't become simply because she was born in Greenwood? Because her family didn't have money? That night, as she lay in bed listening to the crickets outside, Lynn made a decision. She didn't care what anyone said. Somehow, someday, she would play the piano again, and she would prove them all wrong. But for now, the beautiful instrument remained locked away in the community center, as distant and unreachable as the stars in the night sky. Lynn could only dream about it, her fingers moving silently on her blanket as she remembered the feel of the keys and the magical sounds they had made. Outside her window, the moon cast silver light over the sleeping village, indifferent to the small dreams and big disappointments that filled the human hearts below. In the quiet house, Lynn finally drifted off to sleep, her last thought a melody she had yet to play. 2 weeks passed, and though the whispers about Lynn and the piano had mostly died down, she couldn't forget the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers. Each day on her way to and from school, she would walk past the community center and glance at the building, knowing the piano waited inside, silent and untouched. One rainy afternoon, Lynn sat on the covered porch of her grandmother's house, watching droplets fall from the roof into puddles below. Her homework lay finished beside her, and her chores were done for the day. In her lap, she had drawn a rough sketch of piano keys on a piece of paper. Her fingers moved silently over the drawing as she tried to remember which keys had made which sounds. "That won't make much music, I'm afraid," a voice said, startling her. Lynn looked up to see an old man standing at the edge of the porch, sheltering from the rain. He wore a worn jacket that had once been fine, and his white hair was neatly combed despite the weather. She recognized him as Mr. Zhang, who lived alone in a small house near the edge of the village. People said he had once been a teacher in the city before retiring to Greenwood, though Lynn had never spoken to him before. "I know," Lynn said, quickly folding the paper. "I was just—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain. Mr. Zhang smiled. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the porch step. Lynn nodded, and he sat down carefully, his joints creaking slightly. "I heard about your adventure with the piano," he said, looking out at the rain. News travels fast in small places. Lynn felt her cheeks grow warm. "Everyone thinks I was being silly," she mumbled. "Do they?" Mr. Zhang asked. "And what do you think?" Lynn considered the question. No one had asked for her opinion before. I think the piano is the most wonderful thing I've ever seen. Or heard, even though I only touched it for a few minutes." Mr. Zhang nodded thoughtfully. "The piano is indeed a wonderful instrument. I played for many years when I lived in the city." Lynn turned to him, her eyes wide. "You can play the piano?" "I can," he said. "Or I could once. These old hands aren't as nimble as they used to be." He flexed his fingers, which were knobbly with age. "Could you?" Lynn hesitated, then gathered her courage. "Could you tell me about it? About how to play?" Mr. Zhang studied her face for a long moment. "I could do better than that," he said finally. "I could teach you." "Really?" Lynn couldn't believe what she was hearing. "But there's no piano. Mrs. Chen won't let me near the one at the center." "We don't need a piano to start with," Mr. Zhang said. "Many students begin with theory and finger exercises, and I happen to have something that might help." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "Come see me tomorrow after school if you're serious. I live in the blue house past the big oak tree." "I will," Lynn promised, her heart racing with excitement. "One more thing," Mr. Zhang said as he stood up. "Perhaps we should keep this between us for now. Not everyone understands the love of music." Lynn nodded solemnly. She already knew that all too well. The next day seemed to crawl by. Lynn could barely focus on her lessons, her mind constantly drifting to what Mr. Zhang might teach her. As soon as school ended, she raced home to drop off her books and tell her grandmother she was going to visit a friend. "Which friend?" her grandmother asked, looking up from her sewing. Lynn hesitated. She didn't want to lie, but she remembered Mr. Zhang's advice about keeping their lessons secret. "A new friend," she said carefully. "I won't be gone long." Her grandmother gave her a long look, then nodded. "Be home before dark," was all she said. Lynn found Mr. Zhang's house easily. It was small but well kept, with a neat garden in front despite the fall weather. When she knocked, he opened the door immediately, as if he had been waiting for her. "You came," he said, smiling. "I wasn't sure you would." "Of course I came," Lynn replied, surprised that he would doubt her. Inside, the house was simple but filled with books and curious objects that Lynn had never seen before. But what caught her eye immediately was a large sheet of paper spread out on the table. On it was drawn a keyboard with each key carefully labeled. "My piano," Mr. Zhang said, following her gaze. "Not quite the real thing, but it will serve for now." He gestured for her to sit at the table. "We'll start with the basics. This is called the keyboard. Each key has a name." For the next hour, Mr. Zhang explained how the keyboard was organized, how the white keys were named with letters from A to G, and how the black keys were sharps and flats. Lynn absorbed everything eagerly, repeating the information back to make sure she understood. "Now," Mr. Zhang said when he was satisfied that she knew the layout, "let's work on your hand position." He showed her how to curve her fingers properly over the paper keyboard, correcting her gently when her wrists dropped too low or her fingers became too flat. "But what about the music?" Lynn asked after practicing the finger positions several times. "How do I know which keys to press?" Mr. Zhang smiled. "That's the next step." He pulled out another sheet of paper with strange lines and dots on it. "This is called musical notation. It tells you which keys to play and for how long." Lynn frowned at the mysterious symbols. "It looks complicated." "It is a bit," Mr. Zhang admitted. "But so is your writing system, and you learned that, didn't you? This is just another language, the language of music, and I think you'll be a quick study." By the time Lynn had to leave, her head was spinning with new information, notes and clefs, time signatures and rests. It was overwhelming, but also thrilling. Mr. Zhang gave her the paper keyboard to take home, folded carefully so it wouldn't get wrinkled. "Practice your finger positions," he instructed, "and try to memorize the names of the keys. We'll continue tomorrow." This began a new routine for Lynn. Every day after school, she would spend an hour with Mr. Zhang, learning music theory and practicing on the paper keyboard. He was a patient teacher, never getting frustrated when she struggled with difficult concepts and always finding creative ways to explain things. "Music is mathematics and emotion working together," he told her once when she was having trouble understanding rhythm. "The numbers give it structure, but your heart gives it meaning." At home, Lynn practiced in secret. Late at night, when her grandmother was asleep, she would take out the paper keyboard and silently press the keys, imagining the sounds in her head. Sometimes she would hum very quietly as her fingers moved, trying to match the notes she was playing on her silent instrument. After a month of lessons, Mr. Zhang surprised her with a new tool, a small wooden board with black and white rectangles painted on it to look like piano keys. "It's still not the real thing," he said apologetically, "but it will help you get used to the feel of a keyboard with raised black keys." Lynn ran her fingers over the mock keyboard in wonder. The black keys were slightly raised above the white ones, just like on a real piano. "It's perfect," she whispered. Mr. Zhang showed her how to practice simple exercises on the wooden keyboard, moving her fingers from one position to another, building strength and dexterity. "Your hands are naturally good for the piano," he told her. "You have long fingers and a good stretch between them. Some of my students in the city had to work much harder to reach all the keys." Lynn beamed at the compliment. It was the first time anyone had ever suggested she might have a natural talent for anything besides helping her grandmother with sewing. As the weeks went by, Lynn's understanding of music grew. Mr. Zhang taught her to read simple pieces, and she practiced them on the wooden keyboard, singing the notes softly as her fingers pressed the silent keys. "I wish I could hear what it really sounds like," she said one day after working on a particularly beautiful piece called Morning Song. Mr. Zhang's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps we can arrange that just once. The community center is usually empty on Thursday afternoons when Mrs. Chen goes to the next village for supplies." Lynn gasped. "But the piano room is locked." "Ah," Mr. Zhang said with a small smile. "I may have mentioned to Mr. Wu that I used to tune pianos in the city. He asked if I would check on the community center's piano, make sure it's still in good condition. He gave me a key." Lynn could hardly contain her excitement. "When can we go?" "This Thursday. But we must be quick and very careful. If anyone finds out, we'll both be in trouble." Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Lynn was so distracted at school that her teacher asked if she was feeling unwell. When the final bell rang, she practically flew to meet Mr. Zhang at the agreed spot behind the community center. He was waiting for her, looking nervous but determined. "Ready?" he asked. Lynn nodded, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. Together they slipped into the building through the back door. Mr. Wu, as expected, was dozing at his desk and didn't notice them passing by. Mr. Zhang unlocked the piano room and ushered Lynn inside, closing the door quietly behind them. The piano stood just as Lynn remembered it, majestic and inviting. "Quickly now," Mr. Zhang whispered. "Show me what you've learned." With trembling hands, Lynn sat on the piano bench and positioned her fingers over the keys, just as she had practiced countless times on paper and wood. Then, taking a deep breath, she began to play Morning Song. The sound was magical. After weeks of imagining the music, to actually hear it was almost overwhelming. Lynn's fingers stumbled a few times as she adjusted to the feel of real keys, but she kept going, the simple melody filling the room with its gentle beauty. When she finished, she looked up at Mr. Zhang, who was watching her with a mixture of pride and sadness. "You have a gift," he said softly. "Now you know what you're working toward." They left as quietly as they had come, the memory of the real piano keys under Lynn's fingers, a treasure she would hold close in the days ahead. Her secret lessons continued, her wooden keyboard no longer silent in her mind. Now when she practiced, she could hear the music as it would sound on a real piano, and her determination grew stronger than ever. No matter what anyone said, no matter how impossible it seemed, Lynn knew now that she was meant to play the piano. And someday, somehow, she would find a way to share her music with the world. Winter settled over Greenwood, coating the village in a thin blanket of snow. Lynn continued her secret lessons with Mr. Zhang, venturing to his house even on the coldest days. 6 months had passed since she first touched the piano, and though she had only played a real one that one secret time, her skills had grown remarkably. Mr. Zhang had taught her to read music fluently now, and Lynn could play quite difficult pieces on her wooden keyboard. In her mind, she could hear exactly how they would sound on a real piano. Sometimes Mr. Zhang would hum along as she practiced, his aging voice still able to carry a tune beautifully. "You're making incredible progress," he told her one afternoon as she finished a challenging exercise. "I've never had a student learn so quickly without regular access to an actual instrument." Lynn smiled at the praise but couldn't help feeling a twinge of sadness. "What's the point of learning if I can never play a real piano again?" she asked. Mr. Zhang looked at her thoughtfully. "Life has a way of creating unexpected opportunities," he said. "The important thing is to be ready when they come." Lynn wasn't sure what he meant, but she trusted him. She continued practicing every day, her fingers growing stronger and more nimble. Her wooden keyboard had worn spots now where her fingers had pressed thousands of times, the paint beginning to fade. One day in early spring, Lynn arrived at school to find everyone buzzing with excitement. Her teacher, usually calm and methodical, seemed distracted and kept checking the clock. "What's happening?" Lynn whispered to May, who sat next to her. "You haven't heard?" May whispered back. "The district governor is coming to visit Greenwood tomorrow. Everyone's talking about it." Lynn had heard grown-ups mention the district governor before. He was an important man who oversaw many villages in the region. A visit from him was a rare and significant event. "Why is he coming here?" Lynn asked. May shrugged. "Something about new funding for schools. My mom said all the important people in the village have been cleaning and preparing for days. There's going to be a big welcome ceremony at the community center." Lynn's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the community center. That meant they would probably use the grand room where the piano was kept. For the rest of the day, she could barely focus on her lessons, her mind filled with thoughts of the piano and the important visitors. After school, instead of going straight to Mr. Zhang's house, Lynn went home to tell her grandmother about the news. "Yes, I've heard," her grandmother said as she carefully pressed a seam on a dress she was making. "The whole village is in a state about it. Mrs. Chen came by earlier to ask if I could help prepare food for the reception." "Will you?" Lynn asked. Her grandmother nodded. "Of course. It's an honor to be asked." She set down her iron and looked at Lynn. "You should come too. It will be good for you to see such an important event." Lynn agreed eagerly. Any chance to be in the same room as the piano was worth taking, even if she couldn't play it. When Lynn arrived at Mr. Zhang's house later that afternoon, she found him looking unusually thoughtful. "Have you heard about the governor's visit?" she asked as she set up her wooden keyboard on the table. "Yes," Mr. Zhang said, stroking his chin. "I've been thinking about it all day." He seemed distracted, and their lesson that day was shorter than usual. Before Lynn left, Mr. Zhang said something strange. "Tomorrow may be important for you, Lynn. Remember everything we've practiced, and whatever happens, play from your heart." Lynn was puzzled by his words, but didn't have time to ask what he meant. She needed to get home to help her grandmother prepare for tomorrow's big event. The next morning, the entire village was transformed. Colorful banners hung from buildings, and everyone wore their best clothes. Lynn helped her grandmother carry trays of dumplings and sweet rice cakes to the community center. where tables were being set up in the main hall. Mrs. Chen was everywhere at once, directing people, adjusting decorations, and checking that everything was perfect. She barely glanced at Lynn, too busy to worry about a child who had once touched the piano without permission. By midday, everything was ready. The villagers lined the main road, waiting for the governor's car to arrive. Lynn stood with her grandmother, craning her neck to see. A sleek black car finally pulled up, and out stepped a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, followed by a woman wearing an elegant blue dress and several assistants carrying briefcases. The village leader stepped forward to greet them, bowing respectfully. "Welcome to Greenwood, Governor Zhao," the village head said. "We are honored by your visit." The governor smiled and shook hands with everyone. His wife stood beside him, her eyes taking in the simple village with interest. "Thank you for your warm welcome," Governor Zhao said. "My wife and I have been looking forward to seeing your community." The formal greetings completed, the procession moved toward the community center. Lynn and her grandmother followed along with the rest of the villagers. Inside, the main hall had been transformed with tables of food and drinks. The governor and his wife were seated at a special table at the front of the room. The village head gave a speech welcoming the important guests, and the governor responded with kind words about the charm of Greenwood and promises of support for local schools. After the speeches, people began to mingle and enjoy the food. Lynn noticed the door to the piano room was open. Curious, she slipped away from her grandmother and peeked inside. The piano had been uncovered, its polished surface gleaming in the light streaming through the windows. Lynn's fingers tingled with the memory of touching those keys. As she stood there, Mrs. Chen's voice suddenly rang out from the main room. "And now, to honor our distinguished guests, we have arranged a small cultural performance." Lynn's attention was pulled back to the main hall. Several children from her school had been chosen to sing traditional songs, and a few older villagers would demonstrate folk dances. She watched as the performances began, each met with polite applause from the governor and his wife. Then something unexpected happened. Between performances, the governor's wife leaned over and whispered something to Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Chen looked surprised, then concerned, and began speaking rapidly to the other village officials. Lynn couldn't hear what was being said, but there seemed to be a problem. The officials looked worried, and Mrs. Chen's face had turned pale. After a hurried discussion, the village head stepped forward to address the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a small change in our program. Mrs. Zhao has expressed a desire to hear our village piano. Unfortunately, our pianist from the nearby town was unable to make the journey today due to illness." A murmur ran through the crowd. Lynn saw the governor's wife looking disappointed. She clearly loved music and had been looking forward to hearing the piano. "Perhaps one of your villagers can play," Mrs. Zhao suggested. Her voice was kind, but carried an expectation that such a fine instrument wouldn't go unused during their visit. Mrs. Chen looked flustered. "I'm afraid none of our villagers are trained in piano, Mrs. Zhao. The instrument was a generous gift, but we use it mainly when we have visitors from the city." "That's a shame," Mrs. Zhao said. "It's such a beautiful piano." The atmosphere in the room grew tense. The village officials didn't want to disappoint their important guests, but there seemed to be no solution. Lynn felt a strange fluttering in her stomach. She thought of Mr. Zhang's words. "Tomorrow may be important for you." Could he have known this would happen? Had he somehow arranged it? It seemed impossible, but then again, Mr. Zhang had always seemed to know more than he let on. Before she could think too hard about it, Lynn found herself moving forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "I can play," she said, her voice sounding small in the suddenly quiet room. All eyes turned to her. Mrs. Chen looked horrified. "Lynn, don't be ridiculous. You don't know how to play the piano." "But I do," Lynn insisted. She looked directly at the governor's wife, whose face had brightened with interest. "I can play for you if you'd like." Mrs. Chen stepped closer to Lynn, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "This isn't a game, child. These are important people. You'll embarrass the entire village." "Please," Lynn said, not backing down. "Just one song." "I promise I can do it." The governor's wife was watching the exchange with curiosity. "Let the girl try," she said, her voice carrying authority despite its gentleness. "I'd love to hear her play." Mrs. Chen looked like she wanted to object further but couldn't contradict their honored guest. "Very well," she said stiffly. "One song." Lynn felt as if she were in a dream as she walked to the piano room. The crowd parted before her, some faces curious, others disapproving. Her grandmother looked completely shocked but gave her an encouraging nod as she passed. The piano bench felt higher than she remembered as Lynn sat down. She adjusted her position, placed her feet as Mr. Zhang had taught her, and took a deep breath. The room was so quiet she could hear the clock ticking on the wall. For a terrifying moment, Lynn's mind went blank. What should she play? Then she remembered Mr. Zhang's words, "Play from your heart." She knew exactly which piece to choose. Lynn placed her hands on the keyboard, feeling the cool smoothness of the real keys beneath her fingers. It was different from her wooden practice keyboard, but wonderfully familiar at the same time. She began to play Morning Song, the very first piece she had played on this piano 6 months ago. The first few notes came out hesitantly, but as she continued, her confidence grew. The music flowed from her fingers, filling the room with its simple but beautiful melody. Lynn closed her eyes, letting the music carry her away from the watching crowd, away from her nervousness, into a world where only the song existed. When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence. Lynn opened her eyes, afraid to see the reactions of the villagers, especially Mrs. Chen. But the first face she saw was the governor's wife, who was smiling broadly with genuine delight. "Wonderful," Mrs. Zhao exclaimed, beginning to applaud. "Absolutely wonderful." The governor joined his wife in applauding, and soon the entire room was filled with the sound of clapping hands. Lynn looked around in disbelief. The village head was nodding in approval, and even Mrs. Chen, though still looking stunned, had managed a small smile. Lynn's grandmother stood near the back, tears shining in her eyes, her face filled with pride, and there, standing quietly in the doorway, was Mr. Zhang, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction as if everything had gone exactly according to plan. "Young lady," the governor called out, "please come here." Lynn rose from the piano bench on shaky legs and approached the governor's table. "What is your name?" he asked kindly. "Lynn, sir." "Well, Lynn, that was quite impressive. Where did you learn to play like that?" Lynn hesitated, not wanting to get Mr. Zhang in trouble for the secret lessons. I taught myself mostly," she said carefully. "I love music." The governor's wife leaned forward. "You have a gift, child. Have you had any formal training?" Lynn shook her head. Mrs. Zhao turned to her husband. "Darling, isn't there a music program at the provincial school? The one for talented children from rural areas?" The governor nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed there is. A scholarship program." He looked at Lynn with new interest. "Would you like to learn more about music, Lynn? To study with real teachers and play on a piano every day?" Lynn could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Yes," she whispered. "More than anything." The community center buzzed with excited conversation as the governor explained the scholarship program to Lynn's grandmother and the village officials. It would mean Lynn would have to travel to the provincial capital for schooling, but she could return to Greenwood for holidays. As the adults discussed the details, Lynn slipped away and found Mr. Zhang standing by the piano. "Did you know this would happen?" she asked him. He smiled mysteriously. "I told you life creates unexpected opportunities. You just needed to be ready." He touched her shoulder gently. "And you were." Lynn looked back at the piano, the instrument that had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined 6 months ago when she first dared to touch its keys. "Thank you," she whispered, both to Mr. Zhang and to the piano itself. "Thank you for the music." The community center hummed with excited voices. Villagers who had moments ago looked at Lynn with disapproval now crowded around, eager to congratulate her. The governor's wife kept asking questions about how Lynn had learned to play, while Mrs. Chen stood nearby, her expression a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. "I had no idea she could play like that," Mrs. Chen said to anyone who would listen. "Such a hidden talent in our little village." Lynn's grandmother made her way through the crowd and pulled Lynn into a tight hug. "You never told me," she whispered. "All those afternoons with your new friend, you were learning music." "I didn't want to worry you," Lynn said. "I thought you might think it was a waste of time." Her grandmother shook her head. "Music is never a waste of time. Your grandfather used to play the bamboo flute, you know." "Not very well," she added with a small smile, "but with great joy." Lynn looked over her grandmother's shoulder and saw Mr. Zhang standing quietly by the door, watching the scene with satisfaction. She wanted to run to him, to thank him properly for everything he had taught her. But the governor was speaking again, and everyone fell silent to listen. The provincial school's music program is very selective, he explained. But what I heard today convinces me that Lynn has the talent to succeed there. The scholarship covers all expenses: tuition, housing, meals, even a small stipend for personal needs. Lynn could hardly believe what she was hearing. A real school where she could study music, where she could play a real piano every day. It's a wonderful opportunity, the governor continued, but I should be clear, it's also a serious commitment. The program demands hard work and dedication. She'll work hard, Lynn's grandmother assured him. She's never been afraid of that. The governor nodded, clearly pleased. There's one more thing. The new term starts in 2 weeks. She would need to be ready to leave by then. A hush fell over the crowd. 2 weeks was very soon. Lynn would have to leave everything she knew, her grandmother, her home, her village, and travel to a city she had never seen, to live among strangers. Lynn felt a flutter of fear in her stomach. As much as she wanted to study music, the thought of leaving Greenwood so suddenly was frightening. She looked at her grandmother, worried about how she would manage alone. As if reading her thoughts, her grandmother squeezed her hand. "Don't worry about me," she said softly. "This is your chance to follow your dream." Later that evening, after the governor and his wife had left and the excitement in the village had somewhat died down, Lynn went to Mr. Zhang's house. He was sitting on his porch watching the sunset. "I knew you would come," he said, gesturing for her to sit beside him. "You have questions," Lynn nodded. "Did you know the governor was coming? Did you plan all this?" Mr. Zhang chuckled. "I'm not that powerful, child. I knew the governor was visiting, yes, everyone did. And I had heard his wife was a patron of the arts with a special love for piano music. The rest was just hope. But how did you know I'd get a chance to play?" "I didn't," he admitted. "But I believed that if such a chance came, you would be ready for it." He looked at her with pride. "And you were." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. "I'm scared," Lynn finally admitted. "What if I'm not good enough for this school? What if the other students laugh at me because I'm just a village girl who practiced on a wooden keyboard?" "They might," Mr. Zhang said honestly. "There will always be people who underestimate you. But remember how you felt today playing for the governor and his wife, how the music flowed from your heart through your fingers." Lynn nodded. Despite her nervousness, playing the piano had felt right, as if she had found something she was born to do. "That feeling will carry you through the hard times," Mr. Zhang said. "Trust it." Lynn thought about his words as she walked home in the fading light. The path was familiar, every stone, every turn, every tree, but somehow it all looked different now, as if she were already seeing it through the eyes of someone who would soon be leaving. At home, her grandmother was packing her few clothes into an old suitcase. "We'll need to get you some new things before you go," she said when Lynn entered. "Nothing fancy, but clean and proper for the city." "Grandma," Lynn said, sitting on the edge of the bed, "are you sure about this?" "I don't have to go. I could stay here with you." Her grandmother set down the shirt she was folding and sat beside Lynn. "Listen to me," she said, taking Lynn's hands in hers. "When your mother left for the city, I thought my heart would break. I wanted her to stay in Greenwood, to build a life here as I had done. And look what happened. She's working hard in a factory, sending money when she can, but her dreams are on hold, maybe forever." Lynn had never heard her grandmother speak so openly about her mother's choices. "I don't want that for you," her grandmother continued. "I don't want you looking back years from now wondering what might have been if you had taken this chance." She smiled, though her eyes were moist. "Besides, you'll come home for holidays, and I'll want to hear you play every time." The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. News of Lynn's scholarship spread through the village, and to her surprise, many people came forward to help. Mrs. Chen, perhaps feeling guilty about how she had discouraged Lynn, donated a small travel bag. Lynn's teacher gave her a notebook with staff paper for writing music. Even May, who had never understood Lynn's fascination with the piano, helped her pack and promised to write letters. Mr. Zhang gave her the greatest gift of all, a book of piano exercises and simple pieces. "It was mine when I was a student," he told her. "My teacher wrote notes in the margins, advice about fingering, tempo, expression. It helped me then, Perhaps it will help you now. Lynn ran her fingers over the well-worn cover, deeply moved. I'll practice every day, she promised. I know you will, he said. And when you come back to visit, we'll play duets on the community center piano. They won't be able to stop us now. On her last afternoon in Greenwood, Lynn asked for permission to visit the community center one more time. To her surprise, Mrs. Chen not only agreed but unlocked the piano room for her and left her alone. Take your time, was all she said, a new respect in her voice. Lynn sat at the piano, the instrument that had started her on this unexpected journey. She played through each piece she had learned, savoring the feel of the keys, the resonance of the strings, the way the music filled the room. It wasn't goodbye, she told herself. It was just the beginning. The next morning, the whole village gathered to see Lynn off. The governor had sent a car to take her to the provincial capital, where she would be met by representatives from the school. Her grandmother stood straight and proud, though Lynn could see she was fighting back tears. Remember who you are, her grandmother said as they embraced one last time. No matter how far you go or how much you learn, you'll always be my Lynn, the girl who heard music in her heart. Mr. Zhang was there too, leaning on his cane. Play from your heart, he reminded her, patting her hand. Always from your heart. As the car pulled away, Lynn looked back at the cluster of people waving. Her grandmother, Mr. Zhang, her teacher, May, even Mrs. Chen. They grew smaller and smaller until they were just a blur in the distance. Lynn turned to face forward, toward the future that awaited her. The provincial capital was larger and noisier than Lynn had imagined. Buildings stretched up toward the sky, and cars and bicycles filled the streets. The school itself was an imposing structure of red brick with large windows and a grand entrance. As she was led through the hallways to meet the music director, Lynn heard something that made her pause. The sound of pianos, not just one, but many, being played in different rooms. Scales, exercises, beautiful pieces she didn't recognize yet. The sounds blended together in a strange but wonderful harmony. The music director was a tall woman with glasses and a serious expression. She asked Lynn to play something to demonstrate her level of skill. Lynn was nervous. What would this professional teacher think of her playing after only 6 months of lessons on a wooden keyboard? But as she sat at the gleaming grand piano in the director's office, Lynn remembered Mr. Zhang's words. She closed her eyes for a moment, centered herself, then began to play. She chose a piece she had learned from Mr. Zhang's book, one that spoke of hope and new beginnings. When she finished, she looked up anxiously at the director, whose expression had softened considerably. Your technique needs refinement, the director said honestly, and there's much for you to learn. But there's something in your playing that can't be taught, a genuine connection to the music. She smiled for the first time. Welcome to our school, Lynn. We have much to work on, but I think you'll do very well here. That night, in the small room that would be her home for the next few years, Lynn wrote letters to her grandmother and to Mr. Zhang, describing everything she had seen and heard. As she finished writing, she could hear the faint sound of someone practicing piano in a nearby room, even at this late hour. The dedication of her new schoolmates was both intimidating and inspiring. Lynn thought back to that first day in the community center, when she had dared to touch the piano despite knowing she wasn't supposed to, how angry Mrs. Chen had been, how the villagers had whispered about her getting above herself, having impractical dreams. And now here she was about to begin formal music training, surrounded by pianos and people who understood her love for music. The girl who had been scorned for touching the piano had, in a flash, amazed them all. But more importantly, she had amazed herself, discovering a talent and passion she hadn't known she possessed, finding the courage to pursue a dream even when others said it was impossible. Lynn placed her hands on her lap, fingers curved as if poised over a keyboard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pieces to learn, new skills to master. But tonight, she could still hear the applause of the governor and his wife, still see the proud faces of her grandmother and Mr. Zhang. She had taken the first step on a long journey, and wherever it led, she would always carry their love and faith with her, a melody in her heart that would never fade.